Boise, Idaho, October 2nd, 1990. It began with a simple complaint, the kind any parent might dismiss as childhood imagination. My daughter, Sarah, was 7 years old then, with honey blonde hair and a gap-toothed smile that could melt the coldest heart. We'd moved to Boise that summer, into a modest split level on Crescent Rim Drive, with a view of the foothills that turned golden in the autumn light. The house was older, built in the 1950s, but solid. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who'd lived there for decades before moving to Florida for their retirement. It seemed perfect for a fresh start after the divorce. The first month passed uneventfully. Sarah started second grade. I settled into my new position at St. Luke's Hospital. Our weekends were filled with unpacking boxes and exploring our new city. Then came that first complaint, delivered so matter-of-factly over breakfast one Monday morning that I nearly choked on my coffee. "Daddy, there's someone under my floor." I looked up from the newspaper, searching her face for signs of mischief. Sarah had always had an active imagination. Her mother had encouraged it, reading her fantastical stories and letting her watch movies probably too mature for her age. It was one of many things we'd disagreed on before Caroline finally left. "Under your floor, like a monster?" I asked, humoring her. She shook her head solemnly. "No, not a monster. A person. I hear them moving at night." "Sweetheart, that's just the house settling. Old houses make noise, especially when the temperature changes at night." She poked at her cereal with her spoon. "It's not the house, Daddy. They scratch, and sometimes they whisper." A chill ran through me despite myself. "You've been watching those scary movies again, haven't you? The ones your mother lets you watch at her place." Sarah's lower lip trembled. "No, Daddy, I promise." I sighed and checked my watch. We were running late. "Listen, honey, there's nothing under your floor. This house sits on a crawl space, but it's just dirt and some pipes down there. Nothing to be afraid of." "What's a crawl space?" she asked. Her little brow furrowed. "It's just a small area under the house where the plumbing and heating systems are. Not even big enough for a grown-up to stand up in, but big enough for someone to crawl," she whispered. I brushed off her concerns, attributing them to the adjustment period in a new home, perhaps combined with the stress of the divorce. I reminded myself to call Caroline about the movies she was letting Sarah watch during her weekends. I made a mental note to check under Sarah's bed that night, to show her there were no monsters lurking. The next few days passed without incident. Sarah didn't mention the person again, and I began to think the matter had resolved itself. Then came the night I woke to the sound of floorboards creaking in the hallway. It was just after 3 a.m. I'd fallen asleep in front of the television, a half-empty glass of bourbon on the side table. I'd been taking the occasional nightcap and sometimes a sleep aid since the divorce, my stress manifesting in fitful rest. The house was dark except for the blue glow of the TV screen, casting strange shadows across the living room walls. The creaking came again, followed by the soft padding of small feet on hardwood. "Sarah?" I called, my voice thick with sleep. No response, just more creaking. I hauled myself off the couch and moved toward the hallway. There I found Sarah, standing motionless in her nightgown, her back to me, facing the wall near the heating vent. "Honey, what are you doing up at this hour?" She didn't respond. Her body swayed slightly like a reed in a gentle breeze. I approached slowly, recognition dawning. She was sleepwalking. Caroline had mentioned this had happened once or twice at her apartment. but I'd yet to witness it myself. "Sarah, sweetie, let's get you back to bed," I said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. Her skin was cool to the touch, and she didn't react to my presence. Instead, she knelt down beside the wall vent, her movements mechanical yet purposeful. Before I could stop her, she reached out and unlatched the metal grate covering the vent. My breath caught as she leaned forward, pressing her face close to the opening. "I brought you something," she whispered into the darkness of the vent, her voice not her own, deeper, older somehow. "Are you hungry tonight?" I stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Was this some elaborate game, some manifestation of her imagination bleeding into her sleep? "Sarah," I said more firmly, grasping her by the shoulders and turning her toward me. Her eyes were open but vacant, staring through me. I'd read about this, that sleepwalkers could appear awake while remaining deeply unconscious. Still, the eerie blankness in her gaze sent ice water through my veins. I scooped her up, surprised by how rigid her small body felt in my arms. As I carried her back to bed, she remained silent, her head lolling against my shoulder. I tucked her in, watching as her breathing deepened and her face relaxed back into normal sleep. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Instead, I sat in the hallway, staring at the vent she'd opened, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in our new home. The next morning, Sarah had no recollection of her sleepwalking episode. I didn't mention it, not wanting to frighten her. Instead, I asked casually over breakfast if she'd had any more dreams about the person under her floor. "He's not under the floor anymore, Daddy," she said, spreading peanut butter on her toast. "He's in the walls now. He likes to watch us." My spoon clattered against the bowl. "What do you mean he watches us?" She shrugged, taking a bite of toast. "Through the vents, he says he can see everything from in there." "Sarah," I said, struggling to keep my voice even, "this isn't funny. You know there's no one in our walls." "I know you don't believe me," she replied, with a resignation no 7-year-old should possess. "He said you wouldn't." As she spoke, I noticed dark circles under her eyes and a nervous habit I hadn't seen before. Her small fingers constantly fidgeting with her napkin, tearing it into tiny strips. Something was clearly bothering her, beyond just imagination. That day at work, I couldn't focus. Sarah's words and her sleepwalking episode replayed in my mind. The rational part of me knew this was likely just an overactive imagination, combined with the stress of our recent move and the divorce. But another part, a primal part I couldn't silence, whispered that something was wrong. During my lunch break, I called a local pest control company and scheduled an inspection for that afternoon. If there were raccoons or rats in the crawlspace, perhaps the sounds were frightening Sarah. I also called Dr. Mendelsohn, a child psychologist colleague, who assured me that sleepwalking was common in children Sarah's age, particularly following major life changes. "Keep a log of when it happens," she suggested. "Look for triggers, stress, sleep deprivation. Even certain foods can bring it on. And make sure your house is safe. Lock windows, gate stairs. Sleepwalkers can hurt themselves." "What about the things she's saying?" I asked. "About someone watching her?" "Children process anxiety in different ways," Dr. Mendelsohn explained. "Some create imaginary friends. Others create imaginary threats as a way to externalize their feelings. Given the divorce and the move, this isn't entirely unexpected, but keep notes on this too. If it persists or escalates, bring her in to see me." I thanked her and hung up, feeling marginally better. There were rational explanations for everything that was happening. There had to be. The pest control inspector arrived promptly at 4, just after I'd picked Sarah up from school. He was a wiry man named Dave with a salt and pepper mustache and 30 years of experience dealing with Idaho's various vermin. Crawl spaces can be highways for all sorts of critters, Dave explained as he donned coveralls and gathered his equipment. Mice, rats, squirrels. Had a case last year where a family of raccoons set up shop under a house over on Warm Springs Avenue. Made all kinds of racket at night. Sarah watched silently from the kitchen doorway as Dave prepared to enter the crawl space through the exterior access point on the side of the house. Just before he disappeared beneath, she tugged at my sleeve. "He's not there anymore," she whispered. "He knows you're looking for him." Her eyes darted nervously toward the floor, and I noticed her hands trembling. This wasn't just imagination. She was genuinely frightened. "It's okay, Sarah," I said, kneeling to her level. "Dave is just going to make sure there aren't any animals under the house." 20 minutes later, Dave emerged dusty but confident in his assessment. "No signs of any pest activity, not even mice. Your crawl space is surprisingly clean and dry. Previous owners must have sealed it well." "You're sure?" I pressed. "No signs of anything unusual?" Dave raised an eyebrow. "Like what, exactly?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "I don't know. Just anything out of the ordinary." "Well, there is one thing," Dave said, removing his cap and wiping his brow. "Your heating ducts. This house has those old-style oversized ducts from when they originally installed central heating in the 50s. They're almost twice the size of modern ones. Looks like there was a renovation at some point where they expanded the system but kept the original main trunk lines, and one of the connections near the center of the house might be loose. Could cause all sorts of noises when the system kicks on and off. Might want to get that checked." I nodded, thanked him, and paid his fee. As he drove away, Sarah stood beside me in the driveway, her small hand in mine. "I told you he wasn't there," she said. "He's too smart to get caught." That night, I checked every vent in the house, securing each grate with extra screws. I noticed that the older vents had unusually large openings, a quirk of the house's age and the heating system design Dave had mentioned. I inspected Sarah's room thoroughly, looking under the bed, in the closet, behind the curtains. I even pulled up a corner of the carpet, revealing nothing but solid subflooring beneath. When I tucked her in, I left the hallway light on and her door open. "Daddy," she said as I kissed her forehead, "can I sleep with you tonight?" The request was unusual. Sarah had always been fiercely independent, insisting on her own room even when visiting unfamiliar places. "Of course you can, sweetheart, but can you tell me why?" She fidgeted with her blanket, not meeting my eyes. "He gets mad when I talk to you about him. He says I'm not supposed to tell." My mouth went dry. "Sarah, who gets mad? You can tell me anything. You know that." She shook her head vigorously. "I can't say any more. He's listening." I carried her to my room that night, setting her gently on the side of the bed that had been Caroline's. I lay awake long after she had fallen asleep, listening to the normal sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional tick from the baseboard heaters, the whisper of autumn leaves against the windows. At 2:47 a.m., Sarah sat straight up in bed. Her eyes were open but unseeing. Before I could reach for her, she slipped from the bed and walked to my bedroom door. "Sarah," I called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Sarah, come back to bed." She didn't acknowledge me. Instead, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. I followed close behind as she made her way to the same heating vent as before, the one I'd secured with additional screws just hours earlier. To my horror, the vent cover was already loose, one corner hanging free. I could see that the screws had been manipulated from the inside, the oversized metal duct providing enough room for someone to reach the edge of the vent cover. Sarah knelt before it and reached for the edge. "Sarah, stop," I said more firmly, grasping her arm. She turned to me then, her eyes still vacant but her expression contorted with something like fear. "He's hungry," she whispered. "I have to feed him." I pulled her away from the vent and carried her back to my room, locking the door behind us. She struggled briefly before going limp in my arms, falling back into a deep sleep almost instantly. I placed her on the bed and returned to the hallway, flashlight in hand, to inspect the vent. The screws I'd added were gone, and the original ones were loosened. This wasn't the work of a sleepwalking child. Someone had tampered with it from the inside, the expanded ductwork of this old house providing enough space for manipulation I hadn't thought possible. I called the police immediately. The officers who responded took my concerns seriously, especially when I showed them the loosened vent and explained I was a physician at St. Luke's. They found no one during their walkthrough of the house, but made note of the tampered vent. They checked the exterior crawlspace access and confirmed it was securely locked from the outside. They suggested the vent might have vibrated loose due to the heating system, as Dave had suggested, but also acknowledged something seemed off. "We'll note this in our report and have patrols keep an eye on your street," the senior officer said. "In the meantime, document anything else unusual you notice. If you hear anything that sounds like someone in the crawlspace, call us right away." After they left, I checked on Sarah, who slept peacefully, unaware of the commotion. I decided then that I needed to investigate the crawlspace myself, but waited until morning. I didn't want to leave Sarah alone, even for a moment. The next day was Saturday. I arranged for Sarah to spend the day with a colleague's family, saying I had some house repairs to tackle. Once she was safely away, I gathered my tools: a powerful flashlight, a crowbar, work gloves, and my phone. I donned coveralls similar to Dave's and approached the exterior access point to the crawlspace. The small door was secured with a padlock, just as the officers had noted. I unlocked it and pulled it open, revealing a dark, narrow passage barely 2 feet high. The earthy smell of damp soil wafted out, but nothing more unusual than that. Taking a deep breath, I clicked on my flashlight and began to crawl inside. The space was cramped and dusty. Cobwebs clung to my clothes as I navigated around pipes and support beams. The beam of my flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing dirt, insulation, and the occasional evidence of past repair work. I made my way toward the center of the house, where Sarah's room would be above me. The space grew tighter, forcing me to belly crawl through narrow passages. My breathing echoed loudly in the confined space, mingling with the distant hum of the refrigerator above. I was directly beneath Sarah's room when I noticed it, a small area where the dirt floor appeared disturbed. Unlike the compacted soil elsewhere, this patch looked recently turned. Beside it, half hidden behind a support beam, was what appeared to be a bundle of fabric. I reached for it, my hands trembling. It was a dirty blanket, wrapped around something solid. As I unfolded it, the beam of my flashlight illuminated its contents: a half-eaten protein bar, a plastic water bottle, and a small notebook. My blood ran cold. Someone had been here. Recently. Just as this realization hit me, I heard it. The soft sound of movement somewhere deeper in the crawl space. I swung my flashlight toward the noise, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal nothing but empty space. Then I heard it again, from a different direction. Something was moving around me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the confined space. "This is private property. The police have been notified." Silence followed, heavy and expectant. Then from behind a junction of heating ducts about 10 feet away, I saw it. A face, partially obscured by shadow. Pale, gaunt, with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like a nocturnal animal. Male, unshaven, matted hair falling across his forehead. Those eyes blinked, and the face disappeared behind the ductwork. I scrambled backwards, panic surging through me. The sound of frantic movement echoed through the crawl space. Someone crawling rapidly away from me, toward the far side of the house. I tried to follow, but the space grew too narrow, the beams too low. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of movement, but nothing more substantial than shadows. I retreated to the access point and burst out into the daylight, gasping for fresh air. With shaking hands, I called 911 again. This time, the police response was different. 4 patrol cars arrived within minutes, followed by officers with K9 units. They surrounded the house while I explained what I'd found and what I'd seen. One officer stayed with me, while others entered the crawl space from multiple access points they created by cutting through the floor in strategic locations. A couple of minutes later, the officers emerged, dragging a struggling figure between them. A man, thin, wild-eyed, dressed in filthy clothes. They forced him into a patrol car while reading him his rights. The lead detective approached me, his expression grim. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're working on ID now. No identification on him, but we found something else you should know about." The detective led me to a patrol car where an evidence technician was photographing items laid out on the hood. The blanket I discovered, several empty food wrappers, water bottles, and what appeared to be drawings, crude pencil sketches on torn notebook paper. I stepped closer, and my heart nearly stopped. The drawings were of Sarah playing in the backyard, Sarah at her bedroom window, Sarah sleeping in her bed. Detailed, obsessive renderings that could only have been created by someone watching her, studying her. "There's more," the detective said softly. "We found these taped to the beams under her room." He showed me photos on his camera, dozens of similar drawings attached to the wooden supports directly beneath Sarah's bedroom floor. Some included me as well, but most focused on my daughter, capturing her in various daily activities with disturbing precision. "How?" I managed to ask. "How did he get in?" The access door was locked. "There's an old storm drain that runs behind several properties on this street," the detective explained. "It connects to a drainage culvert that empties into a wooded area about a quarter mile away. He'd modified one of the junction points to create an entrance. The storm drain was built when this neighborhood was developed, but the newer maps don't show all its branches. It's practically forgotten infrastructure. He appears to have been using it to move around between several houses in the area. The vents. He was communicating with Sarah through the floor vents, I assume." The detective nodded grimly. "We found small holes drilled in several of your heating ducts. From below, he'd have had clear sight lines into multiple rooms. And yes, he could speak through them too. These old-style ducts gave him more access than modern systems would have allowed. And the pest control guy didn't notice?" The inspector, didn't go deep enough into the crawlspace. He stayed near the access point where everything looked normal. Our suspect appears to have been extremely careful to keep his main living area hidden deeper under the house, closer to where your daughter's room is located. He probably retreated to the storm drain system whenever someone came to check the crawlspace. A wave of nausea hit me as I realized the full implications. While we slept, while we ate dinner, while Sarah played in her room, he had been watching, listening, whispering to my daughter when I couldn't hear. We never spent another night in that house. We checked into a hotel that evening and began looking for a new place immediately. Sarah asked few questions about the commotion, and I volunteered little information, saying only that there had been a problem with the house that made it unsafe. She seemed unsurprised, but I noticed her shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. The man's identity was eventually confirmed as Jerome Wilkins, a 42-year-old transient with a history of stalking charges and mental illness. He'd been released from the state hospital 6 months earlier and had dropped out of his mandated treatment program shortly after. In his subsequent psychiatric evaluation, he claimed the voices had led him to our house specifically because of Sarah, whom he believed was specially chosen to receive his messages. We moved to Portland the following month. Sarah began seeing a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. Slowly, she began to reveal the extent of her interactions with the man under the floor, how he'd first spoken to her 3 days after we moved in, how he'd asked her to bring him food, how he'd told her secrets and stories in the night. He said he chose our house because of me, she told her therapist in a session I was allowed to observe. He said I was special, that I could hear things other people couldn't. The therapist noted that Sarah's unusual calmness throughout the ordeal was actually a concerning symptom, a dissociative response to trauma. Children, she explained, sometimes develop an emotional detachment as a survival mechanism when faced with situations too frightening to process normally. 25 years have passed since that October in Boise. Sarah is an adult now with a psychology practice of her own and a particular interest in childhood trauma. She remembers that time with a clarity that still unsettles me. How vulnerable we were. How close we came to something potentially far worse. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I still wake with a start, certain I've heard scratching in the walls, a whisper from beneath the floor. In those moments, I remember the pale face in the darkness of the crawl space, those eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. I always check the vents nowadays. I always check the vents.